Mortal Kombat has a fascinating timeline. It started off with a bang, and by the time the industry moved into the 3D space, it struggled to maintain its footing at the top as classics such as Virtua Fighter and Tekken became the new kings of the tournament fighter. The fall didn't necessarily start with the series' first foray into the 3D realm with Mortal Kombat 4, as most might suspect. We're going to look over the original trilogy while examining why most people consider Mortal Kombat 2 the pinnacle of the original series. In addition, we'll take a deep dive into the second game to discover what version really is the best. This is Retro Impressions, Mortal Kombat 2, a definitive analysis. Mortal Kombat was first conceived as a response to Capcom's massively popular Street Fighter II. The game utilized digitized images of real actors, giving it a unique, ultra-realistic, and almost futuristic look at the time of release. Midway had only hoped to grab a small piece of the new emerging and popular tournament fighter market, one that was started by Final Fight and confirmed a legitimate moneymaker with the release of Street Fighter II. What Midway ended up with was a series that would net over $100 million in revenue in its first year alone. In order to fully appreciate why the series peaked with number 2, we need to understand the origins and what exactly people were unhappy about with the third game. After that, we will closely examine Mortal Kombat 2. Let's start out by looking at the original cast. The game was revolutionary in many ways, combining a harsh atmosphere with a competent fighter full of a cast inspired by pop culture icons. Johnny Cage started life as Jean-Claude Van Damme. The development team had put together a demo showing it to Van Damme in hopes of getting him on board to make a game inspired by the movie Bloodsport. Van Damme wasn't really interested, so the team scrapped the idea and restructured it into what would become Mortal Kombat. The Van Damme character would become a parody of the man they once hoped to have as a partner, and all other characters in the game would be modeled after Johnny Cage. Scorpion and Sub-Zero were inspired by traditional Japanese ninjas. One is the hunter, the other the hunted, or by color design, Fire and Ice. These two characters' design was heavily influenced by the storage limitations of the era. For the same reasons we have Mario and Luigi, a color palette swap allowed for the inclusion of two different characters while nearly using the same data space required for one. Raiden is based on a combination of Japanese and Chinese gods, mixed with the three storms from Big Trouble in Little China. While everyone else represents Earthrealm or Outer World, Raiden is unique in that he represents the heavens. There's no mystery behind Bruce Lee's influence on Liu Kang. What you might not know is he was originally based on Minamoto Yoshitsune, who is one of the most famous samurais to have lived. In fact, he was going to be called Minamoto Yoshitsune, but it was nixed because of the difficulty in saying his name. Kano was first envisioned as some sort of android-human hybrid. He went through a few design changes before the team finally settled on one inspired by the T-800 from Terminator. The final and seventh fighter was a last-minute addition to the game. Sonya Blade was only included because the team was given an additional month of development time and felt the inclusion of a female cast member would help balance out the experience. Jax, who was originally planned for the game, was replaced with the intentions of including him in the next installment. Sonya was based on Cynthia Rothrock, who is one of the most decorated martial artists of her time. So that was the main playable cast. In addition, there were two non-playable characters. Goro, which was created using clay and stop-motion animation. This is essentially what would later be done in Clay Fighters. This character was heavily inspired by the brilliant work of Ray Harryhausen. Shang Tsung was the final boss and another addition that took inspiration from Big Trouble in Little China. His creation was greatly inspired by the sorcerer Lo Pan. The only other character is Reptile, who you must unlock. Although he's been given considerable personality in later games, he was nothing more than a palette swap in his debut. Scorpion's yellow and Sub-Zero's blue combined equal Reptile Green. He wasn't included in the arcade release, only the Genesis and Super Nintendo versions. But there is one additional thing that makes this character noteworthy. By all accounts, this is the first hidden character in a versus fighting game. While Scorpion and Liu Kang proved to be the two most popular fighters, Kano and Sonya were the least played, so in the second game, both were removed and only appear as prisoners in the background of Khan's arena stage. New characters introduced are Baraka, Jax, Katana, Kung Lao, Mileena, and Sub-Zero. Reptile and Shang Tsung were also now officially playable as well. Okay, you're probably wondering why I just mentioned Sub-Zero as a new character when he clearly appeared in the first game. The reason is, Bi-Han was Sub-Zero, and he was murdered by Scorpion at the end of the first game. This is Bi-Han's brother. Baihan is still around though, as he was resurrected as the famed Noob Saibot, and appears as a hidden, non-playable character alongside Smoke and Jade. There's a ton more we could discuss about non-playable characters such as Blaze, but the major point I'm trying to make is, with few exceptions, the series' most popular characters were mostly introduced at this point, and Reptile was now playable without caveat. For most people, this felt like a reward for being part of the series from the start. Battle a hidden character, and in the following game, you can play as that character, further enhancing the hype behind new games in the series. Mortal Kombat II was another massive hit, and understandably so. The gameplay mechanics were mostly left alone, while the roster was expanded, along with the inclusion of many extra Easter eggs, moves, multiple fatalities, babalities, and friendships. There was a lot more of what made Mortal Kombat so special there to love, and fans ate it up. We'll come back to discuss the available versions a bit more in depth, but first, let's examine just why it's considered the best of what's now called the original timeline by looking at number 3 and why exactly diehard fans were so unhappy with it, even if critically speaking, it was fairly well received. The largest issue for most people was the roster. They brought back Sonya and Kano along with 7 other new playable characters, but people were furious when they found out this was at the expense of some series favorites. Gone were Johnny Cage, Raiden, Scorpion, Reptile, Baraka, Katana, Mileena, Jade, and arguably Noob Saibot, as he was now based on Kano. To say people were upset by this would be an understatement. The new character roster was also considered weak, making the loss of people's mains a bit harder to swallow. People also hated the atmosphere. The first 2 games took place in the fantastical setting of the Outer Realms. Places like the Living Forest and the Pit helped to define the first 2 games. Number 3 answered this call by giving players the Bank and Subway, not exactly what players were expecting from a series known for its dark atmosphere. For the hardcore fans, there was a bigger issue though. The game was broken from a competitive standpoint. Face a player good enough, and once they started a combo, they could keep it going until the other player was dead. Endless combos combined with the unnecessary inclusion of a run button made the game unplayable for anyone serious about competitive play. That's not to say the first 2 games were perfect, or that number 3 didn't have people who loved it. I myself remain a massive fan of all 3 games, and could speak at lengths about why number 3 in particular continues to have a dedicated audience. However, the backlash was strong enough that it prompted Midway to release 2 major updates. Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 restored many of the missing characters and fixed Noob Saibot. In addition, more Outworld locations were added, along with a complete rebalancing of the game, which solved some issues while creating new ones. There would be one more update called Mortal Kombat Trilogy. This would also be the first game not to receive an arcade release for the series. It added additional characters and mechanics, but is widely considered to be the most unbalanced of the 3. It was also panned for its rough, unpolished, and rushed feeling in what many felt was nothing more than a cash grab, especially considering the misleading title. Midway must agree because Ultimate Mortal Kombat is the game used to represent Mortal Kombat 3 in every single modern reissue. To get into the mud for just a minute, there's one additional issue most people might not know about. Due to a legal dispute over royalties regarding payment for use of the actor's likeness in home ports of the game, over half the actors from the first 2 games were replaced. The court ultimately decided in Midway's favor, as the contracts they signed were very clear in what everyone's rights were. The in-game characters affected were Liu Kang, Johnny Cage, Sonya Blade, all the Scorpion-style ninja characters, Shang Tsung, Katana, Mileena, and Jade. So while number 3 has its fans, myself included, 2 is still considered the best of the original storyline games by most people. After all, there's a reason it remains the best-selling in the series. So let's roll things back and take a deeper look into the game most people consider the best traditional game in the series. There are a few ports we won't discuss. The Game Boy, Game Gear, and Master System versions were all poorly executed remakes, while the DOS and Amiga versions are not easily accessible using today's hardware and don't hold up to other home console releases. Accessibility issues aside, they both have technological issues that would keep them ranked at the bottom of this list, so it's best not to waste time discussing them. There are 2 additional physical copies released that we also won't cover. One included in Midway Arcade Treasures Extended Play on the PSP, the other an unlockable in Mortal Kombat Shaolin Monks for PS2 and the original Xbox. Unfortunately, both of these are mediocre emulations of the arcade release. The versions in contention are the Saturn, 32X, Genesis, Super Nintendo, and PSX. First up, let's talk about sound. As I started this journey, I honestly figured sound would be the most cut and clear category I intended to cover. The expectation going in was the CD-based games would be at the top, with the real comparison being an examination for third place. Unfortunately, both the PSX and Saturn really dropped the ball here, relying on their onboard system sound processor to handle everything. Mortal Kombat on the Sega CD utilized Redbook audio, so this decision is a bit questionable. I guess it would be unfair to judge the port based on my expectations rather than what it delivers, so I dived in deep to examine them both. To be fair, the sample quality and effects are superb, although a number are oddly absent, making the game seem closer to a beta than the polished port I was expecting. One of the most notable examples is the lack of an announcer when you select your character and win a fight. The PSX release did add this as an option, but it's defaulted to off. Heck, even the SNES and 32X versions have this. There's a bigger problem though, and it's the weird direction both versions take with the music. It's very much an ambient chill sound that at first glance seems inspired by the original soundtrack, rather than the OST itself. In what I consider a massive shocker, both soundtracks are indeed lifted from the MS-DOS release. It's even listed as such in the credits. It really doesn't fit the game, and with storage not being an issue, there's no excuse. Considering the missing sound effects, I'm more inclined to believe that this is not an artistic decision, but rather a poor implementation of the music, resulting in full audio channels being absent from the final product, and laziness to correct this issue when bringing it over to the Saturn and PlayStation. The PlayStation does include a few additional voice clips and sound effects, plus a music test option that's worthless as all the music is bad, but it's something the Saturn doesn't have, putting it just above that version. The SNES takes up third place. While it has effects that are missing in the Genesis version, the sample quality is downright terrible. The give and take here, which is more sound effects at the expense of overall quality, simply isn't worth it. The audio is oddly mixed, with the music being noticeably quieter than any other version. I have a feeling this was a subtle attempt to hide the low sampling rate. The plus side here is it sounds like the arcade, but the audio experience is more similar to the result you would expect putting a microphone up to the radio in an effort to record your favorite song. This brings us to the Genesis and 32X release. Honestly, there's no battle here, as it would have been more between the SNES and Genesis if there was even a consideration. At a personal level, I prefer the chiptune sound. However, on a technical level, everything that's there is clean, clear, and of high quality. It's all quite good, but at the expense of foregoing a number of samples, such as the ring announcer declaring the round number. The 32X builds upon the Genesis release and fixes most of its shortcomings, bringing it closer in line to the arcade version. I guess when things are good, less explanation is needed.
Round 1. Fight. Round 2. Fight.
Up next is visuals. Feel free to pause the video and look over the screen. What you're seeing is the same Liu Kang, displayed in order by in-game sprite size across the same setting. I'm going to reveal which one is from which version in a minute, but take a second to make an educated guess. You'll also notice I included the number of frames used for the standing animation. On to the breakdown. Like it or not, returning to this game on the Genesis isn't a visually pleasing experience. The limited color palette of the hardware causes a number of issues with ports that recycle high color assets rather than create new ones to deal with the limitation. Toss digitized images at the system and it could become a mess. I expected this version to be at the bottom due in part to this issue. In addition, the game is missing a number of background assets. Here's the deal though. Both the SNES and Genesis games come in at nearly the same size. So the result is truly the action of design decisions between two different companies tasked with handling each port. So while the NES has these missing assets, it does so at the expense of lower resolution textures. It's not terrible, but I promise if you spend a sizable amount of time going between versions, the SNES port starts to look like you're viewing a show recorded on VHS using extended long play, if you get my drift. I don't feel either have aged well, but I'll take lower color counts over one that looks like it's slightly out of focus any day of the week. The rest of this section is very cut and clear. The 32X places third with what I consider acceptable visuals, while the Saturn and PlayStation games are both fantastic. These two versions are nearly identical, with the main standout being the way they handle shadows. The Saturn keeps them solid, as did the arcade, while the PSX adds transparency. It's nearly a toss-up, but this round goes to the PlayStation. It's time to look at controls and the gameplay experience. I played through all 5 games, then played them again in a different order, then again, wash and repeat many more times. Moving from controller to controller wasn't an issue, and pulling off moves seems to be met with the same degree of success no matter what version my attention was turned to. Any particulars between the versions would be just nitpicking and personal preference. I think it might be safe to say that the preferred experience will be the game you grew up with, or the one attached to the controller you like most. It's really a compliment of just how well executed these games are in certain aspects. Okay, so the controls were a wash, but what about the single-player gameplay experience itself? Well, I had quite a bit of fun with the Saturn and PSX versions because I was able to dominate the computer even on the highest difficulty. The AI is incredibly dumb to the point you can crouch the entire time and never be attacked. But the AI is noticeably worse on the Saturn release. The other 3 games are extremely cheap on higher difficulty settings. Not only is the opposition merciless in their attacks, but I swear they mirror the player's inputs on the 32X build. I'm sure that's not the case, but it's one of the few games I've ever played where I constantly feel like the AI has access to my controller inputs, knowing my every move. Thankfully, moving the difficulty meter down makes a difference, so not all is lost for a below average player such as myself. The arcade release feels fun and well balanced, but none of the home versions seem to have achieved that same degree of challenge and reward. When it comes to the Genesis, 32X, and SNES release, moving a character backwards is significantly slower. The arcade and all other versions being discussed here use the same speed to move a character forward or back. It seems a bit odd, and was very noticeable after jumping through the various versions multiple times. With that said, while I'm certain some of you have found odds and ends that don't feel right between these versions, I personally found nothing distinguishing enough in the gameplay department to separate them in rank. There was, however, one exception, and that's with the PSX and Saturn versions. Both games require loading times when using Shang Tsung's morph ability, destroying the pace of a match. The Saturn takes around a second to load, while the PSX can take much longer. It's such an issue. His ability to use these moves is defaulted to off in the options menu. It's honestly unacceptable. And while I was still able to enjoy both versions because the characters I enjoy most are not affected, it's still a very real problem that a core character is neutered in an attempt to rectify loading screens mid-match. So what extras or missing content might each version have? Well, the Genesis and 32X support the activator if that's your thing. Unfortunately, for a dedicated 6-button controller user such as myself, this game defaults to the activator setting, causing the 3-button controller to always be selected. It's a small annoyance that you're required to always change the setting before you can start the game. There are some other small extras from game to game, such as frugalities in the Genesis release, but nothing notable enough to sway a recommendation of one version over another. This brings us to my final recommendation, and I don't think there's many surprises here. 5th would be the PSX release. It released nearly half a year after the Saturn port and appears to be a direct port of that version. Being it's an expensive Japanese exclusive, it's simply cheaper to buy any of the other versions along with the system required to play it. Price didn't actually factor into this though, that's just an observation. The real reason is load times during the middle of a match are unacceptable. For all its extras, it still feels less polished when compared to the Saturn release. Combine this with a soundtrack that is an abomination, and there's no wonder it remained in Japan. The Saturn comes in 4th for the same reason the PSX release came in 5th, but steps it up with better load times and seems to be a more fluid overall experience. Even if the games were identical, the Saturn still has the better controller in my opinion. The Saturn and PSX versions are so close, they would practically receive the same score if I was rating them on a 10-point scale, but my preference is for the Saturn release. 3rd goes to the SNES. With its low textures and audio samples, it's hard to take this version seriously. Still, I appreciate that it included everything from the arcade, and most importantly, it nails it in the gameplay department. If you only have a SNES or you have a preference for that controller when playing this sort of game, it's still quite enjoyable and worth owning. The unfortunate bit is even using RGB, I can't deny this version looks about as I would expect if using RF. Thankfully, it fares okay on a PVM. In the most anticlimactic result I can give, the 32X comes out on top. The reality here is that the SNES, Genesis, and 32X versions all control well, so if you're playing on a CRT or only care about gameplay, you can't go wrong with any of these three. However, when you start getting into the detailed execution of the total package, the 32X is truly at the top. It might seem like nothing more than an improved version of the Genesis game, but that's all the 32X needed to gain a game in its library that has remained the best home option available for an arcade classic for nearly 25 years. Thank you so much for checking out this episode. Your support means the world to me. As always, feel free to leave a positive or negative comment down below. I try to read and reply to everyone and appreciate the opportunity to interact with you all. Until the next episode, to wherever you may be watching, good morning, good evening, and good night. I'm Jenovi, and you've been watching Retro Impressions.